After being the target of 2 assassination attempts this year, you might think Donald Trump would not joke about such violence. But then again, on Sunday, in one of his final campaign rallies before he ultimately won Tuesday's election, he went on a rant complaining about the bulletproof glass, including making this off-color joke. Take a listen.
And I have this piece of glass here, but all we have really over here is the fake news, right? To get me, somebody would have to shoot through the fake news, and I don't mind that so much.
After that remark, Trump's campaign did issue a statement saying that Trump was saying the media should be safe, too. Reporters Without Borders has urged Trump to cease his attacks on the media. It found that in an 8-week period, Trump insulted, attacked, or threatened the media at least 108 times. That does not include social media posts or remarks by other campaign members. Trump has made at least 15 calls for the FCC to revoke the broadcast licenses of television stations. He's sued CBS over a 60 Minutes interview with his rival Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. He's accused the show of manipulating her responses. Trump wants ABC News to be punished, MSNBC and NBC News to be investigated. And during this anti-media blitz, there was something else remarkable about Trump's behavior. He seemed to be retreating from interviews with TV news and pivoting towards podcasters, comedians, and influencers. Here are clips from the Nelk Boys and the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, the first time we met you, 2020, Air Force One with Dana White. Dana White set it all up. And then we had you on the podcast after, I think it was the Afghanistan withdrawal, the horrendous withdrawal.
That
and
disaster.
Then we golfed with you. We've seen you at UFC, and now you're back here for the third time. So we just want to thank you.
Well, thank you. So I always got more publicity than other people, and it wasn't like I was trying. In fact, I don't know exactly why. Maybe you can tell me why.
Oh, I could definitely tell you. You said a lot of wild shit.
Maybe. Maybe
You
that's
said a lot of wild shit,
maybe
and then CNN, in all their brilliance, by highlighting your wild shit, made you much more popular.
Yeah.
That Joe Rogan clip, by the way, has 47 million views and counting on YouTube. Now, last month, 2 of Trump's senior communications advisors told Semaphore that they are, quote, seeing an unprecedented bias in the old guard traditional media, elite media, and that it has pushed away viewers away. And they're finding news in now some of these more fun, different-paced podcasts. Now, journalist Aidan McLaughlin said the media story of this election and the next for years was a rise of the podcaster as a powerful figure in American politics. I'd like to bring in our guest today, Billy Binion, a reporter at the libertarian magazine Reason, joining us. Hello to you, Billy. And also Matthew Foldi, editor-in-chief at the Washington Reporter. Hello to you, Matthew. I want to begin with you, Matthew. At Trump's victory speech, Dana White thanked the Nelk Boys, Aiden Ross, Theo Vaughn, and Joe Rogan. For any of our viewers who are not familiar with these men, and they are all white men, or mainly, how would you describe them and their audiences?
Well, great to be with you guys this morning. And I think that, there's this sort of meme idea trickling around that says, if you told someone 20 years ago that the host of The Apprentice and the host of Fear Factor would be colliding in one of the most important podcast interviews of all time, you, of course, would have been institutionalized. And yet, here we are. So I have been listening to Joe Rogan since about 2021, when CNN started this very financially motivated campaign to get him kicked off Spotify. And so I've been listening to his episodes in order. I'm on episode 672 out of 2,226 now. But what your audience, I think, needs to know is that Joe Rogan is ultimately a normal guy who was once a man of the very far left. This was a Bernie Sanders voter in 2020. But then, as with Trump, who was also once a Democrat, he has shifted pretty far to the right. It's not making him far right. He's not particularly ideological. But ultimately, he threw in a last-second endorsement of Donald Trump after Trump and Kamala Harris both spent the final month or so of the campaign trying to reach out to Joe Rogan's audience, which is, other than this show, I would argue one of the most significant in American politics. It's younger men, which are a harder group to get to turn out to vote. But ultimately, I think it proved fairly decisive in Trump's electoral college and popular vote wins.
Billy, do you think Joe Rogan is going to replace Meet the Press?
I mean, I think I don't know if replace is the right word, but I think that in the US you see like kind of like this unprecedented lack of trust in the mainstream media, and I think a lot of that is earned. I mean, the mainstream press in the US essentially, I think, became obsessed with policing misinformation, but a lot of which ended up being true over and over again. And so I think a lot of people have kind of come away with the fact, this idea that you can't trust anything they say. I will also say, though, while I think Joe Rogan is interesting, he's very curious, and I think that's why his audience enjoys following him and hearing what he has to say. The mainstream press gets a lot of flack for going really easy on Democrats, which I think is totally a fair criticism. And I would hate to see that kind of pendulum swing so far on the other side, where kind of these conservative politicians and figures can kind of retreat into their safe spaces as well. So, I mean, I think Joe Rogan has a lot of power, understandably so, but if he is going to replace the mainstream media for a lot of people, I think it should still be kind of, it should still be journalistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Matthew, the point here, obviously the politicians would be interested in going on Joe Rogan because of his wide appeal, his large audience. But these are softball interviews. If you watch them, there's no real questioning or fact-checking during the interview, is there?
I don't necessarily think that's true. And one thing that's important to note is that in the final days of the presidential election here, Joe Rogan had John Fetterman, who's a top Democratic senator, on, which I think made it all the more jarring that Kamala Harris both blew him off to begin with and then also begged him to go to her. And we learned yesterday that she spent about $100,000 on a set for the Call Her Daddy podcast that she did. And with Joe Rogan, I think that, sure, while he's not your standard journalist, think back to some of his higher profile interviews with people like Mark Zuckerberg. And he asked him, very simple questions. But one of them was about the role of the federal government in dealing with tech companies in the 2020 election. And Mark Zuckerberg said, yes, the feds did reach out to us and ask us to remove content about the Hunter Biden laptop. So Rogan is not a particularly confrontational interviewer, but he made more news, and we learned more about the tech industry's relationship with the federal government than we did from TechCrunch and Wired and all of these outlets run by anti-tech journalists combined.
Yeah, Matthew, just to stay with you, I saw some people crediting Barron Trump with this strategy to include podcasters in the campaign strategy. Was this a gamble for Trump? Was this a brilliant move? Should Democrats have imitated it?
I don't know if that's a meme or if Barron Trump actually was involved in this, but I think that it was not necessarily that risky for Trump in particular because, listen, I've now listened to almost 700 Joe Rogan episodes, and the one thing that matters is that you're authentic. You can be a comedian, you can be a police officer, you can be a politician, you can be a surfer, you can be anything under the sun. As long as you're comfortable in your own skin, you will have, I think, an interesting and illuminating conversation on his podcast. That's why I think ultimately Kamala Harris was trying to have it both ways of looking edgy, saying she was going to do the podcast, and then she never did, while also not actually doing the podcast. We saw, obviously, in her 107-day campaign, she had no idea what she believed on Medicare for all, on fracking, on illegal immigration. So that's the sort of questioning, while, again, not confrontational, but I think Joe Rogan would have said, hey, so do you think that the border should be open? And remember, Joe Rogan was once an open borders guy. I think he would have pressed her in particular on issues that we've now seen were huge liabilities for the Democratic Party, like transgender sports. Joe Rogan actually, in his latest interview with Elon Musk, he identified that as one of his big red pilling moments that shifted him from the far left to now the more, I'd say, center right, civil libertarian right.
Billy, as podcasters like this only become more popular, do you think we'll see a response from legacy media trying to imitate their style, or will they have to find a different way to sort of reel back in more viewership?
That's an interesting question. I think that the people were, of course, discussing this after the results of the election. I think the most interesting comment I saw was someone was saying, or a few people were saying, Democrats need a Joe Rogan. And to Matthew's point, a bunch of people responded like Democrats had a Joe Rogan, and it was Joe Rogan. He was this kind of left-leaning figure who sort of embodies in his own personal journey, what I think a lot of people why people went to them themselves was they were kind of disaffected Democrats, maybe disaffected liberal light, and were just kind of tired of being lied to over and over again. I mean, I will say though, I think one of the biggest criticisms of the mainstream media is that they're kind of hysterical, right? You know, in the wake of the election, you have Joy Ann Reid talking about how Kamala Harris has this flawless campaign. She can't understand why she lost because she was endorsed by Taylor Swift and Beyonce. You know, you see all these kind of like ridiculous things coming from the left-leaning press. But also, I mean, in Joe Rogan's interview with Elon Musk, which Matthew mentioned, you know, they had this conversation about how if Trump didn't win, this was going to be the quote the last election because we would never have a free and fair election again because of illegal immigrants. And Joe Rogan responds like, yeah, I think you're right. And like, that's the kind of stuff that when the mainstream press does, people roundly criticize them, understandably so. You know, say what you want about the New York Times, but when the New York Times publishes a factual error, of which they have published many, they're under an immense amount of scrutiny to fix that. And this kind of ecosystem is not. Maybe they will become so. You know, I think that the pro of democratizing media is that everyone can be a content creator and everyone can have a voice. And the con of the democratizing media is that everyone can be a content creator, because it becomes really incumbent upon the listener or the viewer to verify what they're hearing. And a lot of people don't have time for that, but it's really important whether you're hearing it from the mainstream press or on a podcast.
Yeah, Matthew, 30 seconds. Does an endorsement for Joe Rogan carry more influence than Beyonce or Taylor Swift?
I think it does because it was unexpected. You know, people actually were shocked that he entered the political foray. And I think that the way that the legacy media is going to respond to Joe Rogan is by trying to shut him down. We saw that in 2021. And basically, to sum everything up of why we're here right now, we're here because Seth Meyers mocked Donald Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and he decided to run for president. And because CNN decided to attack Joe Rogan for taking horse dewormer during COVID, that radicalized him even further. And I think, unfortunately, you look at outlets like the New York Times during, for example, Israel's war in Gaza, where they falsely reported on a hospital bombing that never happened. I said to my editor, hey, if I made something up at the behest of a U.S. designated terrorist organization, I hope there would be consequences. But no one was fired.
We're running out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. Matthew, I want to thank you. Matthew Foldi and Billy Binion, our guests. That brings us to our quote of the week. And on election night, it comes from opinion columnist Ezra Klein, who said that Harris should have gone on Joe Rogan's podcast. He wrote, quote, "You go where the votes you need to reach are. Rogan's not even a tough interviewer, but Rogan is symbolic of something bigger. There's an alienation that's grown between young men and much of the Democratic Party. For years, there's been no real way of talking about masculinity in liberal circles that didn't attach the word toxic before it. There's been a reveling in growing female strength and a deep critique of male culture. You can have any view you want of the merits of that, but it's had consequences." That's it for this edition. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.